In this lecture, I plan to deal with the second stage of the breakup of Alexander the Great's empire. And this covers the years from 316 to 301 BC. It ends with the decisive Battle of Ipsus, fought in central Asia Minor today, Turkey, about some 6 or 7 miles due east of the modern city of Afyon, a delightful place in Turkey known for its marvelous cream and fertile crops. The Battle of Ipsus essentially determined that the empire of Alexander the Great would be partitioned. And let us start this lecture with a review of who were the principal figures in 316 BC and what were their aims and ambitions, and how did circumstances turn out that partition rather than unity was the result, because to some extent this was a surprise. In 316 BC, Antigonus Monophthalmus and his son Demetrius Poliorcetes. Poliorcetes is a Greek term indicating that Demetrius is the taker of cities, that he had a reputation of being brilliant in building siegecraft, and he did. He built some marvelous siegecraft. As for taking cities, he wasn't as good as it sounds. Well, but we'll get to that when we reach the city of Rhodes. In any case, Demetrius and his father Antigonus looked as if they could impose their will over the empire and bring to heel the various satraps who hoped to carve out independent lesser kingdoms. And there were several advantages enjoyed by father and son. For one, they controlled by 316 BC most of the Asian empire of Alexander, that is, stretching from the shores of the Aegean essentially to the Hindu Kush. Antigonus had defeated and captured Eumenes of Cardia. That removed the last serious rival who would fight in the interests of Alexander's family. And that victory near Susa also delivered to Antigonus most of the rest of the eastern satrapies of the Alexandrine Empire. For one, Seleucus, who had received the satrapy of Babylon, had fled to Egypt. He knew that he could not stand against Antigonus alone. The so-called upper satrapies, these would just be the satrapies in Central Asia, Bactria Sogdiana, the far eastern Arachosia, Gedrosia, and even those regions that were administered by the various client kings, the family of Porus and Taxiles. Those now all came more or less under the control of Antigonus. So he controlled essentially the Asian empire of Alexander in 316 BC. He also controlled a magnificent field army of some 60,000 Macedonian veterans. Through the course of fighting and the shifting of loyalties in these complicated battles, Antigonus essentially ended up with most of the veteran Macedonians. He had taken possession of some 25,000 talents of the imperial treasury, maybe only a tenth of what Alexander captured, but in the course of his career, but still an enormous amount of money. And this empire gave him an income of well over 10,000 talents a year. The only person who could financially match Antigonus was Ptolemy, who controlled Egypt. The other satraps, and that would be Lysimachus in Thrace, Seleucus when he did have Babylon, and Cassander, who ruled not so much as a satrap, but as the guardian and regent for the family of Alexander. These three figures, they could not match Antigonus in either money or manpower. And generals such as Lysimachus and Seleucus came to depend very heavily on Greek mercenaries rather than Macedonian veterans. Furthermore, Antigonus had a reputation of being a very efficient administrator. He was remembered very fondly generations after his death. Recent scholarly studies have seen in Antigonus the model efficient bureaucratic king. And in some ways, he set the standards for the royal administrations that were created in the lesser kingdoms after the Battle of Ipsus. And there are a number of anecdotes told about his justice and his relatively mild rule over these various subject peoples. He ordered the building of a new capital at the northern end of the Orontes Valley. The city was to be named Antigona after him. It was never finished, and it was eventually finished by Seleucus, the satrap of Babylon, who took over the Asian possessions of Alexander, and it was renamed Antiochia in Greek, and that would be the great city of Antioch, the third city of the Roman world, essentially the capital of Syria. So when this city is commenced in 306 BC, Antigonus has taken the title king. He intends to create a Macedonian royal capital in Syria from which to rule this vast empire that straddled the whole of the Asian satrapies of Alexander's time. In addition, he was popular with the Greeks, or at least initially, to undermine the authority of Cassander in Greece. And Cassander, just like his father Antipater, ruled Greece with a firm hand. There were garrisons in the key cities, the so-called fetters of Greece, Demetrius, Lamia, and the Acrocorinth. He also imposed tyrants and oligarchies who were tied to Cassander personally. And Antigonus and Demetrius were able, on several occasions, to undermine Cassander's position in Greece by sponsoring democracies. And we also know that probably in 303, 302 BC, they revived the League of Corinth, the Hellenic League. There's an inscription indicating that Antigonus and Demetrius styled themselves as guardians of freedom of the Greeks, and in many ways played the role that Philip had played, rather than a more autocratic role that characterized many of Alexander's successors vis-a-vis the Greek city-states. And so both father and son had a very high reputation. Furthermore, the son, Demetrius, in 316 BC, he was 21 years of age. Antigonus was probably around 66, 65. He was a senior and tested veteran in good health. And therefore, father and son promised that they could create a dynasty. Demetrius was married to Phila, one of the daughters of Antipater, who had actually been briefly married to Craterus. Their son, named Antigonus, after the grandfather of this young boy, Antigonus II, Antigonus Gonatus, would one day rule Macedon as king, and he would unite the family of Antigonus and Antipater, two of the noblest families in Macedon from the generation of Philip and Alexander the Great. And Antigonus II, Antigonus Gonatus, turned out to be really in one of my favorite kings of the Hellenistic world. A very, very sound ruler and an extremely popular Macedonian king, and quite unlike his father, Demetrius. Demetrius had quite a reputation. And Plutarch wrote a life of Demetrius, and it's significant to dwell on Demetrius for a bit because he captured the imagination of the generation between 316 BC and essentially 383 BC. 283 BC, that is the final breakup of Alexander's empire, where Demetrius was a major player in all these events. Demetrius, in some ways, was seen as an imitator of Alexander. He inspired Plutarch to write a life of Demetrius. This life was paired with Mark Antony, the subordinate of Julius Caesar. And as I discussed earlier, Plutarch was interested in character and the personality of individuals. And when he chose to write about Alexander, the obvious Roman matchup was Julius Caesar, two of the great conquerors of the Greek and Roman traditions. And then Mark Antony and Demetrius were paired up as two great lieutenants of the great conquerors who could have been the new Julius Caesar, new Alexander the Great, but blew it because of their personal vices, particularly wine and women, the typical vices that are usually raised against great men in all these sources. There's something of a stereotype. So Demetrius in 316 BC, gave the impression that there was a dashing young son of Antigonus, and he deliberately styled himself after the Alexander look in his dress and his manner. There's a couple of passages I would like to read that bear this out. First, Plutarch is really praiseworthy of Demetrius in various military affairs, particularly Demetrius' skill in engineering. This would be put to the test in the Great Siege of Rhodes, which we'll be talking about. And this is what Plutarch writes. As a general, he, that is Demetrius, had a reputation of being more effective in preparing an army than in handling it. He insisted on being abundantly supplied for every eventuality. He had an insatiable ambition to embark upon larger and larger projects, whether in shipbuilding or the construction of siege engines. And he took an intense pleasure in watching the working of these creations. He had a good natural intelligence and a speculative mind, and he did not apply his talents to mere pastimes or useless diversions, which is quite a compliment from Plutarch. Then he goes on. But when Demetrius played the workman, that is the craftsman in all these projects, he did it in a regal fashion. He approached his projects on a grand scale, and his creations were not only skillfully and inventively conceived, but they bore the marks of a lofty mind and purpose, so that men thought them worthy not only of the genius and wealth of a king, but also of his handiwork. Their sheer size alarmed even his friends, while their beauty delighted even his enemies. And this description is true and not merely elegantly phrased. His enemies would stand on the shores and gape in wonder at his galleys of 15 or 16 banks of oars as they sailed past. While his city takers, that's known as a Heliopolis, that is a vast tower to capture cities, as events actually testify, were a spectacle to the inhabitants of the towns he besieged. So in some ways, Demetrius really was an impressive commander, certainly in the logistical and engineering skills. He had a tendency to be too much of a heroic figure, and he would leave cavalry charges and generally right off the battlefield pursuing the enemy rather than concentrating on winning the battle, which is something Alexander never did. Plutarch, however, sees the shortcomings in Demetrius and why he didn't end up uniting the empire. And in Plutarch's mind, this is largely a issue of character. Demetrius only imitated Alexander in pomp and outward show of majesty, like actors on a stage. And indeed, it is true that there was something intensely theatrical about Demetrius. He possessed an elaborate wardrobe of hats and cloaks, broad-rimmed hats with double mitres, and robes of purple interwoven with gold, while his feet were clad in shoes of the richest purple felt embroidered with gold. One of his robes had taken many months to weave on the looms. It was a superb piece of work in which the world and the heavenly bodies were represented. It was still only half finished at the time of Demetrius's downfall, and none of the later kings of Macedon ever presumed to wear it, although several of them had a taste for pomp and ceremony. And really, this was a danger that Alexander never risked, and that was taking the outward trappings of power as the reality of power. Demetrius really did get caught up in the ceremonial. Well, Antigonus and Demetrius in 316 BC looked like the possible unifiers of the Macedonian Empire. However, they faced some very, very tough opponents, above all, King Ptolemy of Egypt. Ptolemy, who took the title of king in 305 BC, was already ruling Egypt as if he were pharaoh. In 316 BC, he was age 51. He had served with Alexander in India and Central Asia with great distinction. He was one of Alexander's boyhood friends, and he aspired to control not only Egypt, but the naval domination of the Eastern Mediterranean. And that would require him to occupy the cities of Phoenicia and Cyprus, the various cities along the southern and western littoral of Asia Minor, the Greek cities of Cyrene, and to have access to the Aegean world where Ptolemy drew his administrative talent, his mercenaries. He was very, very much dependent on contact with that Greek world because ultimately Ptolemy's court in Egypt was a foreign court. It needed Greek personnel to run it. He had the money and the means to undermine Antigonus's ventures. He was also diplomatically skillful in weaving various coalitions that eventually brought down Antigonus and Demetrius at the Battle of Ipsus. On the other hand, Ptolemy had no illusions about his generalship. He knew that he could not stand in battle against Antigonus, that probably Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucus were all better commanders than he was. And there is something fitting about the fact that while he put the coalition in motion that brought down Antigonus at Ipsus, he wasn't at the battle. Ptolemy was always in the background scheming and maneuvering diplomatically. Now, he does win a battle at Gaza in 312 BC, but he really does mass overwhelming force and catches Demetrius by surprise. So let's not get excited here. Ptolemy was clearly not one of the great generals of Alexander, but he proved to be an able king, an efficient administrator, a brilliant diplomat, and died in bed and was made a god. Not bad among the successors of Alexander. Ptolemy also had three associates who had their own reasons to be suspicious of Antigonus and Demetrius. First and foremost was Cassander, who had possession of Alexander IV and of Roxanne. In 316 BC, he would have been about 34 years of age. That is the age Alexander died at. He did not know Alexander, really. He had not served in the army. His father, Antipater, had always had a disappointing approval of his son. He never thought Cassander was quite up to the job, but Cassander did well. He had secured Macedon and gave it good government, and while he ruled Greece with a firm hand, at least it was orderly, and when Demetrius showed up, he overthrew those governments imposed by Cassander, and the whole place became a political mess for the next 10 years. Furthermore, he had an understanding with Lysimachus, the satrap to the east, who also aspired to be a king of Thrace. And he and Lysimachus understood that they were essentially rulers content with regional kingdoms. They were always on good terms. They trusted each other. And in the decisive campaign against Antigonus and Demetrius, Cassander essentially gave his mercenary army for Lysimachus to use in Asia Minor. Lysimachus himself was in a very powerful position. He ended up marrying Nicaea, one of the daughters of Antipater, the one who had been jilted by Perdiccas back in 322 BC, and he had a son named Agathocles, who was to be his heir. And Lysimachus, too, was a boyhood friend of Alexander. At the time, in 316 BC, he would have been about 42, 43 years of age, a mature man, reputedly ferocious. He, according to one account, killed a lion with his bare hands, and that really gets him in the Heracles realm, sort of like an Alexander. And then the third of the coalition was Seleucus, and Seleucus was really the kind of the lightweight at the time. He was about 42 years of age. In 316 BC, he had fled Babylon for the court of Alexandria, where Ptolemy was located. And Seleucus was married to a woman named Apame. She was the daughter of Spitamenes, the Sogdian rebel who had opposed Alexander. And so Seleucus and his son Antiochus, because of this Iranian connection, were very, very popular in the Iranian provinces. But as I said, he had to check out of Babylon in 316 and find refuge with the court of Ptolemy. Ptolemy eventually backed Seleucus to the throne of Babylon in 312, and Seleucus was always grateful for that, and that results in some very important political consequences after the Battle of Ipsus. So Ptolemy, he was essentially content to play the role of the senior king in a political order of lesser kingdoms, rather than to unite the empire. Antigonus and Demetrius were clearly determined to unite the empire. And one of the ways that Ptolemy could indicate that he really was the senior king in this emerging concert of powers, in 323 BC, he hijacked the body of Alexander the Great, which was supposed to be buried in Pella, and transferred it to Alexandria, where it was housed in a huge mausoleum and turned into an extremely tacky tourist attraction. So Ptolemy had the body of Alexander, and later Roman emperors would show up and take various paraphernalia, and a rather unfortunate story that follows. In any case, so Ptolemy, from the start, in 316 BC, knew that he needed a coalition. And the result was, within a year, war erupted. Ptolemy and his three associates, Lysimachus, Cassander, and Seleucus, in exile, made demands on Antigonus, including such demands as, by the way, where's the royal treasure? We should have our part. They made territorial demands which are just impossible. And so war erupted, and in 315 BC, Antigonus and Demetrius looked like they had the advantageous position. They controlled the central position, and they could concentrate massive forces against Lysimachus and Cassander in Europe, or against Ptolemy in Egypt. And essentially, Antigonus's decision was, let's take out Europe first. We can grab control of Pella, the ancestral capital, perhaps secure the royal family, and then isolate Ptolemy in Egypt. And if Ptolemy did not have access to the recruiting grounds in Greece, that is the various mercenaries, administrators, the merchants, the men who made his kingdom run, then you could essentially strangle the manpower off and deny Ptolemy access to those Greek cities, and the job would be all the more easier. And so in 315 BC, Antigonus massed forces and attacked Cassander and Lysimachus in Europe. Now, this proved to be more difficult than it seemed. The Greek cities were really split in their loyalty. Some were favorable to Cassander, other to Antigonus. Antigonus also had the difficult problem of crossing from Asia to Europe. And he was frustrated on several occasions due to weather conditions and the fact that his fleet was never quite large enough to force the crossings. And while he waged a desultory war in Greece between 315 and 312 BC, and he did gain some successes, a number of important cities came over to him. Nonetheless, he could not drive Cassander out of Macedon, and he certainly couldn't do any kind of damage against Lysimachus. Demetrius, during these campaigns, was essentially posted at Gaza, that very important city, the gateway to Egypt, the city that Alexander took 2 months to besiege, and he was detailed with a force of some, maybe 15 to 20,000 men, but a corps of elephants from India, that is apparently elephants surviving from Alexander's time, and he was supposed to guard Ptolemy from breaking out of Egypt to assist his allies in Europe. And everyone agreed, Ptolemy doesn't take risks. Well, as the war dragged on in Greece, Ptolemy did the unexpected. And in late 312 BC, with an army backed by a fleet, and how he got that fleet is anyone's guess, across the Sinai and surprised Demetrius at Gaza. Demetrius rapidly drew up his army. It was overwhelmed by superior numbers, and Ptolemy very cleverly set up devices, chains with various spikes and caltrops, to neutralize the elephants, and Demetrius also played into Ptolemy's hands, because Demetrius loves to lead cavalry charges on the right flank and play Alexander, and he swept the Ptolemaic cavalry off the flank while the rest of his army went down in defeat. So when Demetrius returned to the battlefield, he had nothing left to do except to ride back to Dad and said, "We got problems in the backfield." Ptolemy then detached Seleucus with a flying column, and Seleucus made his way to Babylon and reestablished his position in Babylon. So all of a sudden, Antigonus faced a very, very different strategic position at the end of 312 BC, and that was Seleucus was now in Babylon, and given his popularity, his Iranian wife, his good connections among the Iranian aristocracy, all of those eastern satrapies could secede. Ptolemy went on to occupy certain coastal cities, notably ports such as Tyre and Sidon for a while. He also secured the Greeks of Cyrene. That is, he was beginning to launch a navy in the eastern Mediterranean, and therefore Antigonus had no choice but to pull out of his campaign of Greece and to face this threat in Asia. Well, by 311 BC, by the opening of the next year, it was clear that both sides needed a timeout. Antigonus had really pressed Cassander and Lysimachus in Europe. Ptolemy had spent an enormous amount of money to gain that victory in 312. Mercenaries were getting ever more expensive. And so in 311 BC, Cassander and Lysimachus signed an armistice with Antigonus, and they agreed to get Ptolemy to join it, and he did reluctantly, but Seleucus was excluded. So three of the belligerents come to terms with Antigonus. They essentially is a timeout. Each keeps what he has. And Antigonus hopes to use that time to run down and eliminate Seleucus the way he had once run down and eliminated Eumenes. And so Seleucus is left on his own for the next several years as they, father and son, Antigonus and Demetrius, go after Seleucus. And they never quite bring Seleucus to battle. And meanwhile, Ptolemy really has qualms about deserting his ally, and the treaty is not really a treaty, it's essentially an armistice, and by 307 BC, Lysimachus, Cassander, and Ptolemy are ready to renew the war. They see that the defeat of Seleucus would only strengthen Antigonus's position. It would return him to the position in 316 BC, and in 307 BC, they declare war to support Seleucus, largely because their own kingdoms are at stake. So in 306 BC, a new general war is to be waged between father and son and the four rival satraps who would be kings. Ptolemy's coalition this time is much firmer. All four participants agree to no peace with Antigonus and Demetrius unless all four were involved. Also, they are pledged to defeat Antigonus and Demetrius, and this time to make sure that it's not an armistice, but a decisive defeat, and they will dictate the terms, which will be, in effect, partition. So this is a coalition that is much stronger than the earlier one. In 306 BC, Antigonus and Demetrius again attempt to exploit their superior position. That is to knock out Greece and then take on Egypt. The major forces which are concentrated against Greece and Egypt mean that Seleucus is free to operate in the east. And Seleucus uses 306 to 305, those 5 years of the war, to move into Iran to secure his position in the upper satrapies, and then he cuts a deal with Chandragupta, the Mauryan emperor who is uniting India, and hands over the Indian satrapies, probably somewhere around 305 or 303 BC, the chronology is a bit unclear, in return for 500 war elephants. And these elephants would prove decisive at the Battle of Ipsus. In Greece, Cassander and Lysimachus fight a very concerted effort by Antigonus and Demetrius to win over the various Greek city-states, including Athens. And Ptolemy is really left isolated. And in 306 BC, he suffers a decisive defeat off the town of Salamis in Cyprus, not the Salamis near Athens. It is a great naval victory, the greatest victory won by Demetrius, and the entire Ptolemaic fleet, some 240 ships, are captured along with the mercenary army. Ptolemy's fleet is unexpectedly smashed. And that victory allowed Demetrius and Antigonus to assume the title king. They dropped the pretenses that they are now fighting in the interest of the royal family. And in the next year, everyone else assumes the title king. Ptolemy, Cassander, Seleucus, Lysimachus. Cassander had very conveniently done away with Alexander IV and Roxanne, perhaps in 309 BC. Cleopatra had been strangled at Ephesus on orders of Antigonus. So it was just a matter of time that the successors would assume the title king. And Antigonus led the way. The result of that naval victory was an invasion of Egypt. And it looked like Ptolemy was finished, but he lucked out again. For some reason, the fleets necessary to support Antigonus's army in Egypt could never arrive. There were always adverse winds. One of the fleets was wrecked. And the rumor went out that Ptolemy even bribed the winds, that is, the god Aeolus. But whatever the case, by 304 BC, Demetrius and Antigonus had to pull out of Egypt. Then, for some reason that is still obscure to us, Demetrius insisted on punishing the city of Rhodes. Rhodes had tried to maintain a neutrality, but it was on friendly terms with Ptolemy and also with Cassander and Lysimachus. And when Demetrius had ordered Rhodes to furnish ships for the invasion of Egypt back in 305, 304 BC, the Rhodians had politely refused. Now that the victory, the campaign in Egypt had been canceled, and the fighting in Greece had deteriorated into a complicated war of attrition, and Seleucus was all the way out in the east running around in India, Demetrius decided to waste over, close to 18 months besieging the city of Rhodes to punish that city for not following Antigonus and Demetrius. And this was a foolish use of resources, and it in the end proved to be fatal. The siege was celebrated in antiquity, and it climaxed with the construction of one of these great towers mounted by 12 catapults, standing something like 130 feet tall, encased in bronze. It's known as a Heliopolis, a city taker. That's to what Plutarch referred in that earlier passage I read. And this thing could only be moved by something like 3,500 men, moving it into position slowly day by day. And the Rhodians cleverly negated this tower by diverting a river so that Demetrius just finally abandoned the siege and left the tower. The Rhodians happily took the tower, they melted down the bronze, and made the famous Colossus of Rhodes. That is, that huge statue of Helios that was bestrided the city of Rhodes, its harbor. It was constructed and finished in 280 BC, and then in 226 BC it was collapsed by an earthquake and remained a ruin until, I think it was 654 AD, when the Arab caliph Muawiyah sold off all the bronze to a junk dealer from Edessa, Joseph of Edessa, who transported to Baghdad on camels and was sold in the bazaars on the camels. So there's no ruins of the Colossus of Rhodes anymore. That's a side. Well, that time wasted in Rhodes proved decisive. Because the four allies decided in 302 BC to wage a new campaign. Lysimachus took charge of Cassander's army and invaded Asia Minor. Antigonid forces in Europe had to be recalled to defend the heartland of the empire. Seleucus had returned from India and massed a great army in Babylon and moved in the direction of Asia Minor. Ptolemy, too, promised that he would march out of Egypt with an army and would head for Asia Minor, so that three great columns would converge somewhere in Central Asia Minor and bring Antigonus and Demetrius to battle. It was really Lysimachus's strategic ability and Seleucus's tactical use of the elephants that brought father and son down at Ipsus. Ptolemy missed the battle. He got rumors that Demetrius was on the loose and retired into Egypt and did not make the decisive battle in 301. But in 302 BC, in a complicated war of maneuver, Lysimachus managed to tie down the major forces of Antigonus, while Seleucus and supposedly Ptolemy marched to his rescue in Asia Minor. Seleucus, it took him time to move that large army, to assemble it. Ptolemy, as I said, withdrew into Egypt. But Lysimachus wintered in 302-301 BC in the city of Heraclea Pontica on the Black Sea, and allowed Antigonus and Demetrius to invest him, that is, to try to besiege him, and then broke out in the spring of 301 and managed to march first south and then east along the great military highway, probably through Dorylaeum, and hooking a left turn at Aphion, heading east to meet up with Seleucus. And indeed, they met near this town called Ipsus, probably some 6 miles, 7 miles east of Aphion today. The great battle was fought. We have very few details on it. The account of Diodorus Siculus breaks off before the fighting. From what we can glean, the armies were more or less evenly matched, some 75,000 strong. The advantage was the elephants that Seleucus had, and also Lysimachus's tactical skill. Lysimachus lured Demetrius into an ill-advised pursuit. Demetrius attacked on the right flank with his cavalry and chased Lysimachus off the battlefield. That allowed Seleucus to move in with his phalanx and elephants, and that combination in the end brought down the Antigonid army. Antigonus died fighting in the phalanx, a great king, close to 80 years of age. His son returned to find the battle lost and to find that he was now a king without a kingdom, and he eventually fled to the shores and to his fleet. Seleucus and Lysimachus had decisively answered the question. The empire of Alexander the Great would now be partitioned.